And welcome to Brain the Sizzle, customizing our lab instructions using IDLX and CSS. We're also going to touch on a little bit of HTML and JavaScript in here, but it's going to be a very little bit of both of those. The main focus is going to be in Markdown and IDL and CSS directly. So our agenda here, we're going to go through a few different things. We're going to first talk about what exactly is Markdown and IDLX. Then we're going to move into some advanced syntaxes that we can do within IDLX and the Markdown. And then we're going to use CSS in a couple of different areas, both directly in our lab and in what we call themes, where it can be used across multiple labs. So for starters, let's talk about what is Markdown and why do we use it? Those two questions are really kind of one and the same. We use it because of what it is. So what it is it's a plain text file format. What that means is, like, if you opened up, for example, say just Notepad on your computer, you could start writing Markdown. It doesn't really require any special software. You know, Microsoft Word, for example, you have to have Word. You can't really edit a Word document in anything else. Not with all the full features of it anyways. So it's plain text. There's no dedicated editors to it. And it's an alternative to WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get, editors like Word. So it's not quite as what you see is what you get as Word is, but much more so than something like raw HTML. And the why is for those exact reasons. It's future-proof. The fact that it's plain text, your Markdown files typically have a .md extension just to identify that it's Markdown. But again, using that Word as a reference, you've got the .doc file format and the .docx, and if a program doesn't read that file type just right, then the whole file doesn't work. Markdown's not that way. That is more of an identifier than it is a capability or requirement. It converts easily to HTML, and it's a lot easier to learn and write than it is raw HTML. And it's also an unofficial technical writing standard out there. So a lot of our big companies out there, like Microsoft and Facebook and all those big guys, are using Markdown in some way. It's often their own flavor of it, but it's usually there somewhere, whether that's their documentations or Facebook, for example, like their actual chat service uses Markdown on the back end. So it's kind of everywhere in the technical realm nowadays. Now that we know a little bit about what Markdown is, what is IDLX specifically? IDLX is often used for people to refer to our in-house version of Markdown, but it's actually more than that. So IDLX stands for Interactive Digital Learning Experience, which is lots of different components of the LOD platform. One of those is IDLMD, which is our version of Markdown. IDL Markdown is what that stands for, which includes HTML and CSS support within that document. Replacement tokens, which allow us to have dynamically changing strings or content in both our instructions as well as scripts or other areas of the platform. It's using instructions from external sources, whether that's a GitHub repo, an Azure DevOps repo, or even storing it in like an AWS S3 bucket or an Azure Blob storage. So you can store that Markdown file in any of those locations or directly in LOD itself. Lifecycle actions, which is the notion of every lab has what we call a life cycle, which is you launch a lab, the user maybe saves it or resumes it, they eventually tear it down, then it's eventually fully torn down. Each of those different events we consider a life cycle event, and we can trigger actions at each of those different moments, whether it's running a script or making an API call or sending the user a notification. We can do different things at all those different moments, and we call that life cycle actions. And its activities, which are kind of similar to lifecycle actions. You can run scripts or maybe ask questions, but it's done within the user's environment, and they can pick when to do those or when to activate those, as opposed to lifecycle actions, which have those predefined moments that they're going to trigger. And then lastly, it's themes. So we mentioned that CSS is supported directly in those Markdown documents. That can be a little difficult to maintain. It's not really scalable when you need to use the same CSS across numerous labs. And that's where themes come in. So themes can have CSS applied across multiple labs or even across every lab in your organization. Themes also support JavaScript, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get there. So with that, just a brief overview of Markdown and IDLX, and then we're going to jump right into it. So let's hop over to our class page. So I am going to go, mine says LMS, Learn on Demand, your guys should say workshop, but it's essentially going to be the same page. And then you should see a lab down below here. I just enabled it, so it might take it 10, 15 seconds or so for it to pop up on you guys. Once it does, go ahead and click launch on there. And then once you launch it, hit get started, and I'll wait for everybody here. Now, if like me, you got force logged in, just make sure that it's the account that you were provided specifically for this event, because those accounts were given so we have certain access to things. And if we're using our standard lab developer accounts, we may not have access to those things we need to get to. So I'm going to sign out. I know I'm in my right one, but just to make sure, if you're not sure, I'd recommend just sign out, then log back in with the event account. So I'm going to log in with mine. So you should have your lab on demand on the left, and you should have a set of kind of pseudo instructions on the right. We're going to reference that throughout, but it's not necessarily a step-by-step thing. Anybody not at this stage yet, where they're actually fully logged in using the credentials we provided for the event? One cool thing while we're waiting for people to finish getting set up here, I just want to talk about this template gallery for just a second. I know you guys have probably seen it in some of the other sessions. I just want to really highlight this My Organizations piece. So most of the templates we're going to see in here are all public. So they're ones that we at Learn on Demand Systems have designed and made available. But then you have this My Organizations. And this is where for this particular event, these are all aligned with this specific LOD org. So only all of us here at this event have access to these. So that's definitely a way that you guys can harness that for your own organizations and start doing that same thing. You know, when you have a lab that's like, cool, this is kind of the template we want most of our labs to look like, or at least a big subset of our labs, and we want to keep reusing it, publish that to your own organization's gallery, and then it's available right there, quick and easy. You can either go to your My Orgs, favorite it, or as we were doing here, just kind of search for it in the whole thing. We can do that then. All right, so once we're all here, just as a reminder, from your dashboard, we're just going to create lab profile, search for bring, and then we'll get this bring the Sizzle. From here, we're going to hit create. Number and name, just kind of put something that's unique to yourself so you can refine this later pretty easily. I just like putting kind of my name in there to make it more unique. I'm also going to put a 2 on mine since I did a session of this earlier. And then series, we should have made a series earlier if you did a previous hands-on session. Since I made one as well, I'm actually going to search. If you did not make one or did not do a hands-on session, go ahead and do that create option. And you're going to want to name it just kind of like this. You know, again, stick your name in there somewhere. And then this is kind of the framework we've come up with, that if you really want to make it unique, that's saying that it's our launch 2020 Q3. And then it's your lab series. So you can always go back and find that real quick and easy. All right, and then I'm just gonna make these 120. So go ahead and do that as well, just since we're gonna be in here for a little while and we wanna make sure it doesn't expire on us. And that's it. Description, you can put one in there if you want. I'll put a little something. That's totally up to you. Once we create that, we should get dropped directly on that lab profile. And then from there, we're going to go to edit instructions in the top right. So I'm going to select that, and then I'll wait there and just make sure everybody's here. If anybody's having a little bit of trouble getting here, just let me know. Perfect. Sounds like the silence bodes well. Sounds like everybody's here. All right. So this is our Markdown editor, and this is what we call WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. So again, it's not exactly like Word, you know, so where I'm about to type here, this is not going to become bolded text and all that kind of stuff. We're going to mark it as bold here, but it's slightly different from standard like Word type WYSIWYGs because you get these two views. You get our editor, and then you get what we call the preview. So as you see, what I typed goes in here. You may be sitting there kind of going, you know, why does it matter? You know, why do we need two views for the same thing? And where that comes in is once we start doing some of this more advanced syntax or even some of the basic stuff, like if I just put one hashtag here, now that just changed everything and how it looks on the right. So it's a very simplified way of authoring kind of HTML. So this one hashtag means that it's a H1. So I'm going to clear all that out here, and I'm going to start with just a couple of words. Let's go ahead and throw in customizing instructions with a colon at the end. Then I'm just going to go to the next line. I'm going to throw in IDLMD syntax. So what I want to show here is the importance of our line breaks. So Markdown has what's considered soft line breaks and hard line breaks. So what we're seeing here is what's called a soft line break. I have a line 1 and a line 2, but on my preview, it's all line 1. Like these are all combined. This is essentially a line break just for an author for a visual separation. Can't speak. To make that a hard line break, or in other words, force that IDLMD to the next line, we would just put 2 spaces at the end of our line. And now you see that actually drop down. Now, there's actually a third kind of break, which is actually kind of a full element break. In HTML terms, it's a new paragraph, but it's just kind of a truly hard break, which is if we get rid of those spaces, we just stick an empty line in the middle, we get an actual empty line. So that is kind of the most extreme version of a break, and it's recommended anytime we're doing different elements, we always put a hard break like that in the middle. So when we, if this is a header and then this is our text, it's always a good practice to put that space in there, because some things do act a little weird if you don't have a space between your elements like that.
Hey, I have a question.
What's that?
On my preview, after I put the second line, like I hit enter after the colon, and then it went down to the second line. And on your screen, it looked like it all stayed on one line in the preview, and mine already looked like 2 different lines, even though I only hit enter and I didn't put 2 spaces.
It might just be the spacing. So like this moves. Was it kind of like this? Was it maybe just the spacing that was here? So
no, it's really it's like half and half. It's really big.
And there's no spaces at the end of this line, it's just colon and then.
Yeah, it's just a colon in there, and I want to know like if I want those to be.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess it doesn't matter. I could just
it
type it on the same
maintain
line
as just being a soft break. I'm not sure why it wouldn't. Maybe let's take a look at that later. We're not going to do too much on the basic parts of Markdown here, but if we have some time at the end, we can take a look at yours and see kind of why it's acting weird like that.
Okay, thanks.
So for right now, we're just going to put that all on one line, though. We're going to put that one hashtag, which makes it a header. Like I just said, we're not going to do too much on this basic Markdown stuff. It's really just a very, very much an intro. For more of that basic stuff, though, there's this cheat sheet here. So this is in this little question mark. And this has all that basic syntax, like your different header levels, or how to put a link in here, how to make it bold, all that kind of stuff. And as far as bold and things go, I'm just going to hit Control B here. Like your standard Control B, Control I works. But as you see, it actually does inject characters to do that. So that cheat sheet can help go a long way getting used to how to use Markdown. And if it's not quite enough, if you need more explanation, if you're really, really new to Markdown, it's great to go into that Learn More button here, which then goes into a lot deeper documentation about not only Markdown itself, but even a lot of our other IDLX components. So it's good stuff to know about for, just constant available resources. All right, so let's open up this table code snippet. Tables are a really great way of elegantly providing kind of configuration type information, or in this case, it's credentials. We see things like, if you need to deploy a virtual machine on a cloud provider or configure a software of some way, maybe you have to type something into 3 fields and hit a checkbox somewhere, and there's just a whole bunch of stuff, and maybe you have to have a whole list of steps that you'd want them to have to put in. That's kind of the way it's traditionally been done in labs that we've seen. And we're starting to see more of a shift into the table model because it's a lot kind of prettier experience for the user. It's just this username, password, or whatever other field instead of being kind of like a bulleted list. So we do recommend getting familiar with tables. And what we're going to do here with this one, this is the basic Markdown syntax for a table. These up here define the headers, and these pipes that they're called. So on a US keyboard, this is if you press Shift and then the key above Enter, you see I get more of those. That's how we define how many columns are here. So like if I put another one and then I just put stuff, And then another one of these, this separates the headers from the rows. But you see I got another column in here. So you can make that table kind of as big as you want. We're just going to do 2 for demonstration purposes. But that then gets into the concept of replacement tokens. So the replacement tokens is a way to provide easily known objects from LOD's perspective. So for example, a virtual machine password and a username, LOD knows those because we have those fields on our VM profile. But from lab to lab, that may be different. So a consistent way in your instructions to just always provide that without having to hard code in what those are. If you change those in the future, you don't have to go back and update your instructions. We do what's called an @lab token or a replacement token. So we're going to go into this @lab menu up here on the top left. And this has a full list of all these different types of tokens and what they actually replace with. So in this case, I'm looking for a virtual machine-based one. So I'm going to go to this virtual machine and the username. So this LOD training tells me which virtual machine it is. That's the name of our virtual machine on our lab profile. So I'm going to double click that, or you could click insert. That's going to put it in right wherever your cursor is. And as we see, it goes in there and it's already replacing with my virtual machine's username. I'm going to add a couple, and by a couple, I actually mean 3 plus signs on either side of this. This makes it type text. So now if a user is active in that virtual machine, they would just click this and it's automatically going to type it in the virtual machine for them. So if them knowing how to type that username is not a lab goal, that can be really beneficial in order to just get them through things quick and give them a lot better experience. If we did 2 pluses instead of 3, for example, this would make it copyable. And notice how that T goes away. Now it's just a couple of sheets of paper. So that would copy to my clipboard. So depending on your scenario, if it needs to interact with a virtual machine or if they need to copy it to their clipboard, we can make that text do that. Now we're going to put another replacement token here. I'm just going to do 6 pluses in a row because I want to make this one type text as well. I'm going to put my cursor in the middle there. And then I'm going to just type in @lab dot. Now, this is another way to get that full list of replacement tokens. But if you're sitting here typing away, you're in the groove, you don't have to open up a menu to do this. You just type in that @lab dot. As soon as you hit that dot, you're going to get this full list of tokens. Now the difficulty may be, you got to come in here and go through this whole list and find the virtual machine. The other reason that this makes it really beneficial and quicker than going through that menu is I know I want a username, or actually I want a password. So I know I want a password. I'm just going to type in pass and it filters for you based on that. So I want my virtual machine password and boom, there we go. Now it's fully populated for me. Next, we want to talk a little bit about links. So links are really, really basic. The syntax, if we copy this Slack link code snippet that we have in our instructions, this is how we do a link. This is the text that the user is going to see. And then this is where the link is going to go to. Not difficult. That's not what we really want to talk about. That can easily be found in the cheat sheet. What we want to talk about here, though, is accessibility requirements. That's been a big, big thing for a lot of our clients lately. Making sure that a lab is compliant with screen readers or being able to tab through things. So in order to make this link more accessible, if I hover over this right now, you see I get the actual link down in the bottom left, which is kind of a standard browser thing in most modern browsers, but that's it. There's no tooltip on it, so therefore a screen associate anything with it. So what we're going to do is put a space at the end of our link, and then in quotes, just add a little bit of text. In my case, I'm saying the LODS Slack community. Now, if I hover over this link, it actually has a description aligned with it. So we got that link now accessibility compliant, and all we did is add a little bit of text and quotes. Quick and easy. Next thing, let's talk a little bit about code blocks. So these things that you're seeing over here in our instructions, all of these are code blocks. So these are kind of giving a way of pre-formatted text. Using this table as a great example, I'm trying to show here how to create a table. Obviously, if I just put that in my markdown, it's just going to give me a table. That's not great. I want that to present as plain text for everybody. In order to do that, let's go ahead and copy our code block snippet. Because the other thing that we have to think about is not just whether or not the markdown wants to convert that into another format, but is spacing. Spacing in Markdown is different than spacing in like a Word doc. We see here I've got, a tab or 4 spaces. Here I've got a tab or 8 spaces. But it's all, on here it's all one big line. In Markdown, one or more spaces is kind of the same as one space. So if I want this formatted exactly the way it is, I'm going to put 3 backticks on the top and 3 backticks on the bottom. The backtick is the key to the left of the 1 on a US keyboard. And now we see that gets formatted in that exact way, which is exactly how we want it to look here. We're going to add a few modifiers onto this code block now. Some are a little more basic, but some get a little more advanced. So we're going to start by just putting in bash. So this is defining the code block in any way. This I could put whatever text I want here, and that's just giving it a label of some sort. Now, potentially I do want this to surface to the user, so that looks great if that's my goal. But maybe on the other hand, I only want this here so I can maybe find all of my code blocks that are bash. I could do a control F and go find all of these real quick and easy. So it's more of an author tool than an end user one. In that case, notice how I just put a dash here. We're going to put an LOD modifier on here. So I'm going to put no tab, and now it gets rid of that. So LOD supports the ability to modify these code blocks to meet your lab's needs. I'm going to add a couple more on here actually, so we can support more than one. We have, I want to say 5 or 6. They're all available in the cheat sheet. We're just going to do 3 here though. So next I want to do no color, and I want to do line nums. Now I'm going to undo that real quick. Notice how I have this green text. It's because it's what's called pretty print. It's trying to kind of format it based on the language that it's detecting. But if I don't want that color, I don't want it to look that way at all, I'm just going to put in some no color. Now it looks more like plain text. Line nums is actually a really, really awesome one. Particularly, so in this scenario here, we only have 3 lines. Line nums might not be very necessary here. But if you have a big section of code, if I had 10, 20, 30 or more lines, and I want somebody to reference, lines 5 through 10 or, 9 through 16, that could be really hard to translate without having line numbers on there. So it gives you an easy reference way to do that. And then there's also parameters such as no copy, which is another good one. We see by default, this is copyable. So in that same sense of I only want people to reference a few lines, it's reference-based code. It's not actual do something with this. You stick that no copy, and now all they're going to be able to, or all they're going to really need to do is look at it, and you have line numbers on there to easily reference where they need to go look. So lots of flexibility in how you can use those code blocks. And again, there are still more modifiers in the cheat sheet. Any questions on any of that stuff? I know we just went through quite a bit, but before we get into the next little bit, I just want to get a gauge for where everyone's at.
Hi, James. This is Jessica. I don't know if AJ is responding to this, so I'll just ask the question. So if we're putting in a link, let's say, like the Slack community link that you mentioned, does that mean that, like, let's say you have a virtual machine and that virtual machine has to have, okay, hold on. AJ just answered it, but I'm not sure I understand the answer. So I guess what I'm saying is, if a VM has the networking capability, is that, or those instructions with that network, with that link in them, tied to the VM network, or are they using some other kind of networking capability or networking connection?
That's a great question. So by default, these are just like a standard web page link. Like if I click this, it's just going to open up in my browser. However, so what you're looking for there, now let's say we wanted this to open up in our VM. Let's say it was something like open up the Office portal, and we want it to open up inside of the VM for them. This link in itself will not do that. But looking in our cheat sheet, so in here, I'm just going to come in, I'm going to do a control F for command. And there's this part here where it says commands. So in a virtual machine, you can interact with most modern browsers. Chrome supports it, Edge Chromium supports it, Firefox supports it. They all have a way to open the browser to a specific web page. So you'd put a little bit of PowerShell or Windows command line command in there that would manipulate it. But this would appear to the user as plain text. So if I did this, so notice how this has the @ symbol. That's us saying But other than the @ symbol and these backticks, this looks pretty much like a normal link. So those couple of differences are how we tell LOD this link or this command needs to run inside of the VM. So if I did on here, for example, if I put the @ and I put these little backticks in here, we're going to see my link change. And now it has this little power symbol. So now that's telling us that's going to run a command, and that command could be activating a browser inside of the VM to do something.
Oh, okay. So is the @ symbol and the backticks, that's for a command of any kind? This one just happens to be a command to open up a link in the VM on a browser.
Correct. That could be a link to delete a file, create a file. You know, that link could really do anything you could do with like PowerShell, for example, or even if it's a Linux virtual machine, anything you could do with Bash.
Okay, cool. All right, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Great question. All right. So our next section here, we're going to talk a little bit about references and includes. So these are ways to kind of reuse content over and over in either the same lab, different labs, or a combination thereof. Additionally, the concept of the include is a way to manage our content externally. So let's start out talking about a reference. We're going to take this code block that we just built. We're going to knock it down one line, and on the line above it, I'm going to put in this greater than sign, space, a square bracket. So the top up and above to the left of the enter key. And I'm just going to type in bash code. Now this could be called whatever I want to call it. I'm just choosing to call it bash code. The importance here is that whatever you call it is also what we're going to need to reference later. So for example, in this snippet that we're going to end up using, you'll see I have bash code here as well. So whatever is here has to match whatever's on your reference here. Aside from that, I'll give you guys a really handy shortcut with our editor, especially when we're doing things like this. So in order to make this a reference section, we need to put these little greater than signs in front of every line that needs to be referenced. So to speed that up, I'm going to put my cursor at the very top, and I'm going to hit Control-Alt-Shift, then I'm going to press the down arrow. Notice how every time I'm pressing my down arrow, my cursor is growing. So I can modify multiple lines at once. In theory, I'm going to hit delete a couple of times. So I can actually delete multiple lines at once, but that's not what I want to do. I'm going to hit that greater than sign. I'm going to hit a space, and there we go. Now I just made that whole thing into a reference section with a few clicks. The space between these is totally optional. It's not required. I just really like it. It visually separates it for myself. But that is absolutely your call. If these were all kind of flush against the carrots, it's not going to break anything.
This might be a silly question, but what's the shortcut for a Mac user?
Ooh, Control-Shift-Alt is on a Windows keyboard. What is it for Mac? Is Control different for Mac? Is that the?
I don't know. I've got Option and Command.
Yeah, I think it's Command. I'm not sure. That's a good question.
Okay.
Control. So it is the same for Mac because I've used it in Sublime text editor. So Control does carry the same function. My newer MacBook has a Control button.
Right. I don't have an Alt button.
It's Option.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Good question. But that actually brings up a great point. I don't know if this is going to show Mac options, but if you press F1 in our editor, you'll notice that this is all the different keyboard shortcuts. It may detect that you're on a Mac keyboard. So it might be a cool thing to open up and look at. I don't know that for sure. Dylan, you might know that. You use a Mac.
Yeah, let me take a look.
But yeah, so this is all the different keyboard shortcuts. So if you're looking for something in particular, you can even search in here. So, you know, if I just search for cursor, that's kind of exactly what we were just doing there.
Okay. So I was looking in my lab. How did you get to that search bar?
F1.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
And that's all your keyboard shortcuts. All right, so with this reference section, now that we've defined it, what we'll notice is it's no longer in our lab manual. That's because now we have to tell LOD where to use it. That's where we're going to use this little bit of text where we're going to inject it into the lab. So we stick that above our reference. That could be anywhere. It could be above it, below it. Personally, I like keeping my reference sections kind of all in one area, because if you have a lot of these, then it gives you one place to update it. And looking at this right now, we may look at it and go, well, why did we bother doing that if it's just right where we had it anyways? But the purpose of it is to show what we can do with it. So for example, if we had to use this in 3 different places in our lab, we need that same set of code where maybe they're going to reference line 1 through 3 somewhere and lines 5 through 9 somewhere else, but we want to use that same set of code. We can just use this same reference, and look how many times my code now gets in there. So instead of having to add this in a bunch of places, and then if we ever have to update it, now we have to update it in a bunch of places. We just define it once, and we can use it over and over and over again. Now, where references get really powerful is in includes, which is what we're about to do. Before we get into the includes, though, I just want to show that these links, kind of like we saw with the @ symbol here, how it turned it into a command after we did a few things. This exclamation mark on this one here is saying that it's in line, so we actually see this code block. Instead, if I were to get rid of that and I put an up caret, now it turns into a link where this is the text on the link, and it opens up a dialog window. So we can change how those links work and manipulate. So now let's talk a little bit about includes. So includes, they do require that they're pulling in external data, essentially. So it has to be an external markdown file somewhere, whether that's an Azure storage account, an S3 bucket, GitHub file, anything like that. But the caveat is it does have to be publicly accessible. So thinking of like an Azure storage account, it has to be a public blob, or at least a blob access blob. In GitHub, it would have to be a public repo, not a private repo, because it's something that we're not authenticating in any way to access. So it has to be accessible publicly. And depending on what it is, that may not be an issue. You know, if it's something, it doesn't matter if the whole world sees it, it's a small section, then it may be okay, but that is up to you and your organization to decide what's acceptable as an include and what's not. In this particular case, I just stuck it in here. So I copied the include that we have over here, and I put it in between my header and where we log into the VM. And what we'll see is a few extra things got added into my lab. So I'm going to cut that out just so we see that again. Now my login, add it back, and now we get kind of a subheader, something about a lab instance, and another dialog link, which has our reference. So that's the other big strength of references, is you can have that reference locked in that include. Maybe you use that include in 100 different labs with the same reference, but this code block needs to be different in all those labs. So you'd use the reference, you put the include in there, and then the reference is just different in every single lab. Instead of us having to replicate this whole formatting across all the labs, we use an include for that. And we put in the dynamic content. And just to show that that would be dynamic, I'm just going to add a little craziness in here. And then I'm going to click on this link again, and we see that it is updated. So despite it being stored in a GitHub repository, it's still also pulling in dynamic data based on our lab. So something else we're going to see here is the downsides of using that externally sourced data is maybe it doesn't know about our lab. There's one potential that that GitHub file is designed specifically for our lab. In that case, it is functional with replacement tokens. We could put these tokens right in there and it's going to work just fine. The other side, though, is maybe we're using that include because it's used in multiple locations. Maybe we use that for documentation for our product, but now we also want to build a lab that's kind of based on it, but we can't put tokens in it because now that's going to break the documentation. So when things are, or maybe we don't even maintain that document, somebody else maintains it, but we want to kind of take it in and repurpose it for ourselves. All those things are obviously kind of hurdles over using that externally sourced content with cool things like replacement tokens. That's where, rather than replacement tokens, LOD has the concept of replacements. So we're going to go into our @lab menu here, but let's take a look first at this lab instance. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's essentially referencing on our help tab here, our lab instance ID. Now this is static. This is authored in there at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We want that to be dynamic though. We want it to change based on our lab. So in our at lab menu, there's going to be this replacements section, and we are going to add a replacement, which is going to find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and replace it with a lab instance token or a replacement token. So it's going to be at lab.labinstance.id. So we're taking this static content and replacing it with our variable content. I'm going to click OK. And we'll see that this now gets replaced with a little placeholder. That's because we're not in a live lab. Once we get into a live lab, that's going to be replaced with an actual number. So lots of capabilities in that there. What I'd like to do real quick is we're going to close out of our instruction editor. We're going to come right back though. So go ahead and exit out of your instruction editor. Launch this lab that we're in. And then once it starts to load up, either minimize it, stick it on a different window, somewhere so it's no longer on your screen. So we want to go right back into this mode. We just want to give it some time to boot up because there's a virtual machine in there. So once you have that, make sure we close that window down and go right back into our edit instructions. I'm just gonna give everyone a minute, make sure we're all on the same page. Let me know if you do not have the one lab running, but we're back in our instructions.
Hey, James, while that's happening, can you just cover, like when I was first creating my very first lab, I saw this concept of lab manual, and I'm wondering how it relates to lab instructions. And I know you mentioned something like that a couple minutes ago, but I just was wondering if you could clarify that distinction.
Yeah, so when we're on our lab profile here like this
Yep.
lab manual is it simply, so when we go into our edit instructions, this is our preview of kind of what this is. The lab manual is kind of just the preview. So if I open this up, all I see is the instructions. So it is the same as the instructions, it's just not editing. You know, you can't see the markdown. It's just kind of a read-only. This is what your end user is going to roughly see. It's not going to have the live replacements like that, though.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
So it is kind of one and the same, just slightly different purposes.
Okay.
Good question.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so back in our edit instructions, we're going to do one more thing while we're waiting on that lab to load up, and then we're going to go into that lab. So we're going to talk a little bit about variables within our lab. So I'm going to close out this include one. Now, what we'll see in my instructions here, well, in all of our instructions, is we have these text boxes. These are currently hiding some content. So if you guys are developing labs for instructor-led scenarios, this is a way that you can give your instructors the ability to control the pace at which their users progress through the lab. As instructors, you know, that can often be one of the hard things is a user progresses way further in the lab than the rest of the class is, and maybe they start presenting questions about that deep access or deep points in the lab, and it just kind of throws off the whole pace of class. So if your instructors need some sort of control like that, we can implement these kinds of things, which is what we're about to do. In here, we're going to type in case sensitivity does matter, so capital I input, and then press enter, and we see we're going to get some more fields that come up. So all of these are already in our instruction manual. We're just hiding it until I, as the instructor, give the users access. And we're going to pop open this text box code snippet. We're going to copy that right into our lab here on line 23. And then we're also going to copy this @lab variable that's below it. So what we'll see here is we get one of these text boxes in our lab. We see that when we define it, it's using that @lab text box, and then it has this food after it. So when we have that text box, that food is being defined as creating a variable. So this @lab variable food exists only because our text box created it. So if I type something in here, now that gets replaced with that. So this is all these other tokens we've used so far is us using information LOD is already aware of and presenting that to the user. Now this is using information LOD has no idea about, and the user is giving it to us. Then we can replace that anywhere in the lab, whether that's in a code block or just in our plain manual like this or wherever. scripts all over the place. So I'm going to clear that out for now. I'm going to get rid of this variable in my line here. But what I do want to do here is we're going to replace these grapes. This lab says that my favorite food is grapes, and that's not true at all. My favorite food is actually eggs. So I put egg in here. Our manual is still hard-coded to grape. If I open up that dialog, this still says I like grapes. So let's replace that grapes. We're going to use the built-in search, so we can hit Control H, and that's going to open up a find replace here. The really powerful thing about the find replace in the editor, though, is you can base it on either case sensitivity or regular expressions. So I notice how I have a lowercase g, and it's still finding grapes 1 of 1. If I check this match case, now it has to have that uppercase G, and you can do regular expressions, so you can do really powerful searches in here. But we're just going to replace that with that exact variable that we have here. We want that to be our actual favorite food. And just to make sure that worked, I am going to open this up again, and it says my favorite food is egg. Perfect. Now, one thing to be aware of when we're doing these kinds of things and editing them in our live editor like this is that it ends up creating in our @lab menu a variable here. And whatever we've left in there becomes the default value for that. So if you launch a brand new lab, that's the default value. So when we're actually editing our lab, we want to make sure we clear that out. And I'm going to leave that empty. And then I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this editor entirely. We're going to go back to our lab profile. And now we can go back into that lab we launched. So now what we should be looking at is a live lab running a VM with a set of instructions, and then our kind of cheat sheet snippets over here on the far right. We're getting into kind of what's going to become a complex screen because of how much we're going to have going on. So I want to go a little slow and make sure everyone has a kind of a similar view here that I have. And then the one last thing we're going to do before we keep moving forward with this is I want to refresh this because I actually launched this before I put that text box in there. So you'll notice it's not here. So it is updating the labs on the fly, but if a user is active in the lab already, all they have to do is refresh it. So I refresh my screen, and now my text box is there. All my instructions are up to date. Well, notice my lab instance is now actually replaced with my lab instance. So that token is working that we used the replacement in order to use. Remember, this data is actually, or rather the text is stored in an include on GitHub that has a static number in there. We used a replacement to replace that dynamically on the fly. Once we have our lab and our snippets, we're gonna hit our hamburger menu, edit our instructions. So we will have a third window open here. I'm just gonna minimize this a little bit. I'm gonna stick it right on top of my VM so it's not in my way. We're not accessing the VM just this second, so that's fine. We had a question here about the @lab virtual machine console. That is something that's coming out. Chris, I see you're in here. Can you speak to that? That's not in production yet, correct? That is still to come.
I could take a look at that for you, James.
It's in production.
Oh, it is in production.
Type it. Let's go.
All right, let's take a look then. It's a good question, Connor. This will be new for me as well. Oh yeah, look at that, our virtual machine console. Beautiful.
Yeah, it's a great feature when you don't need a full screen for a VM, when you can just embed, small snippets of a console, like a, command line console for users to interact with. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of power there. So you could, for example, have this VM not even set really to showing in our lab, and maybe the user is only interacting with this big list of instructions, and then we pop a VM up for them to actually go in and mess with their recycle bin, and it's full interactive.
Right. Now, my question was, I saw a demo where you can actually resize the console view, and I know that's not going to work the best for Windows, but for Linux, you can actually adjust the console size. Is that something you can show? there was a way to, I guess, follow along that token with a screen size or a
Correct.
console
I'm
size.
putting some in here. Is that not
Container
applicable for
con-
VMs?
Correct. Container terminals, you can control how many rows and columns appear. But virtual machines, they just render at the size as defined on the virtual machine profile. So
Got
if you
it.
want
Okay.
to set that to like 800 by 600, you just go in and edit the VM profile to set up that value.
Got it. That makes sense. Perfect. Thank you for that.
Awesome. Good question. All right. Now I took that out and I'm just going to go ahead and refresh my connection here. So I am connected to the VM. And then I'm going to bring my instructions back over here. So now we're going to do an activity. Activities are often used for scoring purposes. You want to assess that somebody actually did something properly. But another really cool use of activities is for manipulating the environment. In our case, we're going to create a file on the desktop. But this could do anything from, break the environment on the user. Maybe they just spent hours building it up. Now you have an activity that you run, it breaks something on them, and they have to go back in and fix it, figure out what exactly broke. Or it could also deploy things to a cloud provider. There's all sorts of uses for activities. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit this little lightning bolt icon at the top here. And while we're talking about activities, this is another way that we can do gating by the instructor. So we have this ability to do questions, which if we look again in our lab instructions here, that's what this last one here is. This is actually an activity in our instructions. If I click next, it's not going to let us go forward. If I put some text in there, it's still not going to let us go forward. It wants the exact text that we're looking for. So that's where another place that your instructor can control just how far the users can progress. On the other hand of that, maybe it's not based on the instructor giving them a password. It could be based on they have to actually do something. If they do that thing, now they can progress. So we're going to do actually, though, an automated activity, which means that it's going to be a script of some sort. In our case, we're going to do a PowerShell script. Let's go ahead and open up our activity code snippet and just copy in all this little bit. The name field is optional. We'll see when we save it why it's actually really important, though. It helps us when we're looking through our list of activities to know what's what. Our replacement token is how we're going to reference that in the lab instructions. This custom eval button, we're going to hit the checkbox and we're going to name it. By default, the button to activate an activity is going to be called check, or if it's scored, it's going to say score. But like we have in ours, how it says unlock next page, that's just using this little bit here. So you can define for yourself what that button says. And then if it were correct, it's going to tell us that the file's been added. If something goes wrong, it's just going to say something went wrong. Now we want to open up that dialog where we put our stuff in here. We're going to copy this whole thing out, and that's going to become our activity. Now, what we'll notice with this, though, is we have this food placeholder. I want to replace that with the actual variable. So at lab.variable, and right there's my food. The last thing on the activity that we need to make sure we keep in mind is, again, these are largely used for scoring or assessing that things were done in a certain manner. So it is always expecting a true false Boolean result. So we're just going to put in a $true to say, yep, everything's good. That's all we needed to do. So I'm going to save that and let me know if I've lost anybody yet. So I want to make sure everybody got that part done right.
James, this is Jessica. So I just want to make sure the activity you're describing here is initiated by the student? Is
Correct.
that? Okay.
Yep, we're going to add it into our lab next. So once our activity is all set to go, we could hit insert on here, or I could have hit save and insert. What that's going to do is it's going to put that activity in for you right where your cursor is. Since I have no idea where my cursor is right now, I'm going to copy it out, close, and my cursor is where I wanted it to be anyways. So now I just paste that in there, and now I get a create file button. So I want to make sure I fill in my favorite food since it's using that. My food is an egg, and I'll hit this create file. What we're going to see is on my desktop, that file will appear right there, my fave food. Open that in Notepad, and it's formatted exactly the way that we expected it to be. Just a real quick way to add some interactivity and manipulate that environment in some way. So another way of using variables, kind of like that text box is great for when it's an unknown. It's something we want the user to tell us. Well, on the other side of that, we could still allow the user to make choices, but we're giving them the choices that they have to choose from. So in this case, let's go to this drop-down code snippet. Let's copy that and put that in our lab. And now we see we have another replacement token, this @lab.dropdown list. We have another value in parentheses. So just like with our food on the text box, this is creating another variable that's called option. And then we have in the square brackets here what those options are. So none, salad, or chicken. So now on my lab, I have an actual drop-down menu with none, salad, or chicken. Now, currently, that's not doing anything because we have nothing in our lab that's using it. So let's go into our next section here. We're just gonna type in hidden as our password, and then we get a few more sections that pop up. So we're gonna use this section definition, and we're gonna copy these two fields. So these are adding in what's called a div in HTML. So it's a way of HTML to isolate different sections within a document. So in this case, it's creating a div by using these 3 colons. And then it's adding a class to that div, which we can use to then customize with CSS like we're going to use later. So right now we just have these couple of divs, and we're going to stick the right text inside of these. So I want some salad text, and I want some chicken text. And now if we go down on our menu here, or on our instructions, well, that didn't quite come out the way I want it to, because no matter what choice I make, it doesn't change anything. So what we need to do is we need to make these sections align with our options. So even though I named this salad and I named this chicken, that's just really for styling. In order to make these actually map and match with one of those options, we add in a parenthesis option equals. So option is, again, whatever we defined in our drop-down list. And then it needs to match one of those values. So this is what I want when we say salad. So now if we come over here, it says salad, we see salad, but we also see chicken. Well, I picked chicken and our salad went away, but our chicken, but see, even if I go to none, our chicken is still there. So we just have to do the same thing on chicken. This into chicken. And now those sections are unique to whatever the user selects. So that can be a really, really cool tool to use. One of the common scenarios we see with that is, using various code languages. Maybe they want to do PowerShell or they want to do Bash, and they just select which one, and your instructions all change based on that. Now, another way to harness these are with these divs kind of hard-coded into your lab manual, which once you get into doing a lot of instructions, might get a little cumbersome. So if we go back into that option of includes, I'm going to stick this image URL in here. So that's right here from our image code snippet. If we copy that, stick that below our divs, now this has an image that is called none. And it just has this, it says that no selections made, even though it's salad. So it's that same kind of, it doesn't change. So we're going to replace this none with our @lab again, @lab.variable option. So now this will match whatever I've put in my dropdown. And now my image, as well as the text that's coming with that image, is all fluctuating. So the way that's being done is in this remote GitHub repository, I have 3 different files, all called something.md. One is none.md, one is salad.md, one is chicken.md. So LOD is taking this URL and it's injecting our choice in replacing in this section that I put the variable. So if you have those documents named similarly, except for one little bit that matches what your selection is, you can have that kind of variability without having to do different sections, just with one link. Now, the last thing we want to talk about with these kinds of things and this type of dynamic capabilities is languages. So you want English versus Spanish and that kind of stuff. That's a really popular thing nowadays, especially as more and more things are going to online-based training. Globalization is big. So we're going to take the we're going to open up this API language configuration. We're not going to do this over the API, but we are going to talk a little bit about it. So we're going to copy this first one. We're going to put this all the way up right below our header. And this is going to give us another drop-down list, which is defining the language, which in this case, we can choose between English or Spanish. So right now, we see that does nothing, nothing changes. In this URL here that we already had, I'm just going to add a dash and then another @lab.variable, in this case, the language variable, because this is doing the same way we just did, where it's just a file in GitHub that's named a little bit differently based on the contents. So now English versus Spanish actually changes this intro that we have. Now, doing it via the interface like this is definitely an option, and it can be very powerful, but using it over the API can be even better. One of the limitations that we see with this is, none of my other UX elements change along with it. LOD does support somewhere upwards of 10 languages. They're right on the lab profile that we can look at. It's everything from like Chinese, Korean, Spanish, German. So there's a lot of options. If you're using our API, you can access the launch documentation. And I'm just going to copy this link. You guys don't have to copy this one. It's here for reference, but I'm going to copy it in here just to show you. So everything up through here, this is kind of a standard lab launch link. This is kind of the bare bones. If you're already using the API, you're already using all of those parameters. These are some new ones that are defined on this particular call. This lang equals AS or ES is harnessing the LOD language setting on that lab profile. So if you look in the chat, Dylan just added a screenshot of the different languages that the lab profile supports. There's a list of what that shorthand, so like ES is Spanish. So there's a list of those in the API documentation. So that's going to change what your UX is based on. Now, LOD has no idea what your instructions are. Those are all user defined, which is why we have to do something like these variables in order to make that change as well. So then we add another parameter on our URI call, or on our API call, where we say that we're going to create a variable. That variable is going to be named language. And then we say what that variable is going to be. In this case, it's going to be Spanish. So that would make it so I don't need this dropdown. This dropdown would go away, but it would still set it based on English or Spanish or any other language and change the instructions accordingly. That sounds a little more complicated than it is. If that's something that you're looking to enable and you're having some trouble figuring it out, please let us know. We'll be happy to help you out with it. Once you've done it once or twice, it's really easy, and from there on, it just goes really quick. So I'm going to cut that out of my lab now. It's mostly just for reference. So I want to take a short break here. We're going to stop for about 10 minutes. Before we do that, I just want to open it up to any questions. I know we went through a lot here. So does anybody have any questions before we take a short break?
Will we have access to the little customizing lab instructions student environment thing after today?
Kristen or AJ, did you guys know what we're doing for post-event, or if we are?
Sorry, slow on the mute there. I believe the special credentials for this event are due to expire after the 4th, after this weekend. So you have a couple days to play around in there.
Okay, thanks.
All right, well, with that, let's take a short break here. Right now it is 5:14 my time, so we'll come back in 10 minutes. So that'll be 5:24 my time. So go ahead and take a quick break, grab a drink, use the restroom, and we'll be here. All right, we are back. Give people another 30 seconds or so to kind of trickle back. But once you are back at your computer, to move on, we're going to return to our open lab. Actually, let me go ahead and move this to the next slide. Our password to move to the next page is going to be pretty colors. I'm going to put that into the chat here. Go. And I'm going to get my couple of windows back up and running. All right, pretty colors, and then click unlock next page. Once you get this little green thing that pops up, then we can click next and carry on. Now, due to all of the components that we have in Markdown, there's typically not a lot of need for using raw HTML in your manual, but it is supported. There's a few different types of things that you'll actually see a little more commonly than others. Some is, maybe it's just a way to put a class on an element. In our case, we do this a lot with these divs, but there may be other needs or other ways to do that. Another one that we see pretty commonly is the use of detail summary sections. Yeah, Scott put in chat there, underline as well. Yeah, there's no current way in the Markdown implementation to underline. So yeah, if you want to do like, yeah, let me just underline, this chicken bit here. That's some basic Markdown that you can do, or HTML that you could do, a little U and U. Whoops. So yeah, that's a good example right there. Something very basic, lightweight. You typically don't need it for too much though. This detailed summary we're going to talk about is a very cool way though, and something that we see a lot of people wanting to use. This is a modern implementation for collapsible sections. There are other methods of doing this kind of stuff that are a little more legacy. So something to keep note of with these kinds of detailed summary things is legacy browsers, in particular, IE, Internet Explorer. If if a big part of your user base uses Internet Explorer, you may not want to use this. But if most of your users are on modern browser implementations like Chrome, Edge Chromium, Safari, Firefox, all that more modern stuff, these are really cool tools. Everything we're doing in this manual here with these little drop downs, these are all detail summaries. Now, if some of your users, a subset uses IE, you can still use these. It's just worth noting that it's not going to be collapsible like this. Internet Explorer is going to force it to always be open. So that's the difference you're going to see in those more legacy browsers. So we're going to put this little detail summary section in here. The way these work is you've got details that defines a broad area or section. And then the summary is just the visible text that becomes the expandable thing. So now that I've put this in my lab, we just see this little food examples, and there's currently nothing in it. So we're going to add this apples are fruit and broccoli is a vegetable. And now we see when we expand that, our text gets shown. So that is a cool way to do, a cool, simple way of doing expandable things. Many other implementations of open closed sections like that are going to rely on JavaScript. So this cuts that out of your implementation. Let's go ahead and put our password in here for our nested details. So this is going to allow us to do multiple tiers of these detail summary sections. So I'm going to put in here complicated, just like an Avril Lavigne song. And we're going to copy this. Sorry, I made myself chuckle there. We're going to put that in. We're going to replace our apples or fruit line. So now we have, what we have here is a details section here, which kind of closes on the bottom, but then we have more detail sections within it. So in my mind, the way that this should work is it's kind of a hierarchy. Think of a bulleted list, how you have your main bullets and then your sub bullets. But as we look at this in our lab, we'll see that's not how it really looks. It just looks like a normal list, not like a hierarchy. So we'll fix that when we get into our CSS. But the main thing we want to point out just right here is that all of these detail summaries work, even though they're kind of nested within each other. So now that we did that little bit of HTML, that's all we're really going to do with HTML. We're going to now flip more into the CSS portion of it. And let's talk a little bit about how we can modify various aspects of the lab and how that affects other areas of the lab when we do that and preventing that from happening. So one of the first things that we want to do here, we have these dialog links in here, right? Perhaps we want this to look different than a regular link that's just going to open in my browser. I want my user to think this is a button, so I want to put some button-like styling on it. So let's go ahead and copy this link CSS code. I'm going to go all the way to the top of my lab manual. And in here, I'm going to add a couple. So this is another HTML tag. It's a style section. So we're just going to open style, close style. And then in the middle there is where we're going to paste this code that we just took. Now, what this code is doing is it's taking an A element and it's adding all this stuff to it. How we found what to do or what element we're modifying in the first place is using the browser's dev tools. So I'm in Edge Chromium. Regular Chrome is going to work very similar. Your other browsers might say a different option, but it's going to be the same essential way of opening this. But if I right click this link, because this link is what I'm trying to make look pretty, I'm going to inspect. This opens up what the browser calls DevTools. So this is telling us, you see how this has the A there? That's how I know what kind of an element this is. And then there's other subcomponents there like IDs and classes, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And that's how we kind of filter out the other components that are getting changed on us. So one thing to note though, before we even think about some of those other classes, is let's just think about our other tabs here. So if I go to my resources, this link changed. My help tab, these links all changed. That's not what I wanted to do. So one of the first things that we really should think about doing here, I only want it on my instructions. All three of these tabs have a way for us to filter out where we're going to affect or where we're going to apply this CSS. In my case, they're all defined by a class. And a class with CSS, you just put a dot and then the name of the class. So this is dot instructions and then the A. So all A elements on this instructions page get that styling. Now my other pages remain intact. Now I know I didn't mess with any of the rest of the client. You know, same with if I want to do, for example, the help tab. Now my instructions stay the same, but my help tab is fancy. So we can control exactly what we're modifying based on that. And we're going to want to keep that in mind as we continue to do more and more CSS. So we've got that. It's only on our instructions page. That problem is solved. But now we have another problem of I only want the dialog links. I don't want, you know, these regular links to be having this effect. So this dialog is something that LOD has on its own, and we can look at the fact that it has this class of dialog link, and we can specify that. But something to be careful of when we're looking at those kinds of things is that, you know, there's always the potential that that may change in the future. So I'm going to put this in here. Right now I know that works, but if LOD ever changes anything, you know, there's always potential that that class that we're using changes. So we might want to define our own class and our own way to really isolate that link. So we're not going to do it with this link right now, but we could do it with the link. We're going to do it with our intro actually. So we're going to take our introduction. We want just our introduction to be centered. So we're going to take this CSS here. We're going to copy this and stick this up in our CSS as well. This is now going to look for a class called intro, and it's going to center it. That's all it's going to do. Right now, this didn't do anything to our lab. It's all exactly the same. But we're going to use that div section that we learned about earlier. We're going to put our 3 colons. We're going to call this intro, and then we're going to close it. And this is on that include we have that puts our intro in there. So now what we see is now this is all centered, but everything else is not. So I'm going to pluck this, and we see that it goes back to left aligned, put it back in there, and it's centered. So now this is something that is never going to change unless you change it. You know, it's reliable. You know it's there. You know it's going to be static forever. The other thing, though, that we still have to keep in mind, what if something else, you know, what if for some reason we end up adding an intro class over here on the resources tab? So we still want to make sure we specify it to our instructions. We want to lock it in so it's only going to affect that page unless we truly do want it to affect other pages. For example, if you want all your links to be bold throughout the whole interface, that's fine. You can do that. Nobody's going to stop you. But in the event you don't, our .instructions class is going to be key. Now, the next thing we want to look at is, remember that detail summary. We wanted that hierarchical type of view. Right now, it's just kind of a big cluttered list. Now we could do things like doll up what it looks like. We could change even that little arrow that's turning. You can change that icon. You could make it look a little more like a header with the font size and the bold and all that stuff. We're not going to get that deep into it. We're just going to give it that hierarchy look. So I'm going to copy this out and I'm going to paste it in. But before I paste it in, actually, let's take a look at how this is kind of structured. So we have a details, and then we see that these are kind of tabbed in. So there's a details within a details. So now when I go and I paste this little bit of CSS in, that's exactly what it's looking for. It's looking for a details, or a details which is preceded by a details. And then it's putting a little bit of margin on it. So now if I open this up, now I get that hierarchy type of view that we were looking for. If I had, now you can nest more of these if you really wanted to. You know, if I wanted to put a third layer in there, I could. And then maybe I would just copy this again and stick another level in there. And then maybe that one would need to be 20%. So you can make that as deep as you need to go, but that's essentially kind of how we would work with those, is stick a little CSS on it, doll it up however you want those sections to look for yourself. The other thing though, just like we were just talking about, stick it on instructions. We never know where else details are being used in the interface, and it can get really, really dangerous doing that kind of stuff. And we're going to see why in just a minute. This is all live in the lab. So you guys are seeing I'm pasting the CSS in here. My lab is updating on the fly. This is a great way when you're first designing a theme, or when you're just trying to see how you can play with it. This is a great way to do it. But once I've finalized it and I say, this is perfect, this is exactly how I want my lab to look, I'm going to cut this right out. So I'm just going to highlight it all and do a Control K on my keyboard, cut it out. I don't want it there anymore. Actually, no, I'm gonna leave it there because we're going to go back to our lab, our LOD first. So we're going to leave that there so we don't lose it. And then go back to LOD itself. Now, if you've closed this window or minimized it or otherwise lost it, just go over to your resources and click on Lab on Demand. That'll pop it right back up for you. And then from here, we're going to go to our admin page. Before we get too much farther in this, I do want to pause real quick and see if anybody had any questions on that stuff that we just did. No? Okay. All right, so from our admin page, we're going to look for themes. It's going to be in our lab profile section. I just like always doing a Control F, saves me some time. Here we go, we want themes. So themes, like we said, it gives a kind of persistent capability to that CSS while also allowing us to do things like JavaScript. So we all want to create a theme now. We want to make this somehow unique to ourselves. So we are going to name this theme. I'm just going to make it, my launch 20, Q3, custom theme, my name. Again, I've done this session already, so I'm just going to add a 2 onto this. A really cool thing with themes is perhaps your organization has a particular theme like that you guys already have. You already have this color scheme that defines who you are as an organization. Perhaps the lab UX that you have here with all this white background, it doesn't match your theme. Your theme is more of a dark type thing. Or maybe this is your theme, it is more of a white based background, and you don't want people having a drastic change on that experience. So right now as a user in my lab, and you guys can do this too, you can choose whatever theme you want. I can make this any color. I could go dark mode. If you as an organization or just for that particular lab for some reason do not want people to do that, on your theme, you can specify, this has to be dark, or this has to be the blue theme, or leave it up to the user. Nobody cares. One thing with user choice, though, to be careful of is once we start messing with colors, on here, for example, we put these colors on here. If you're putting colors and not locking the theme, it's important to make sure that that color looks good. See, so this looks really bad on the dark theme. So that's something to be careful of when we're manipulating colors, but still allowing user choice of the theme. We want to make sure it looks good on both or lock it down. Let me get back to my theme here that I was making. I'm going to go ahead and just force this to blue. You guys can either leave it user choice or change it. That's totally up to you. And then we're going to do our CSS. So now we will cut this out of our lab profile. And what we'll notice with that is if you now look in your lab, all of that stuff reverts. You know, this is no longer centered. We no longer have the color, none of that. But now we're going to put this in a theme, paste it in. So with the themes, we don't need the style tags. LOD takes care of that for us. Also with the themes, it reminds us about these dot instructions and dot resources and dot help. So that's always there, even with a small little example for how to tweak your CSS if you've already defined it. These tabs up here, we're going to play a little bit with the instructions script and the instructions CSS. Odds are that's the place you're going to be interacting the most with a theme. So instructions relates to anything in this navigation pane here. So whether it's, you know, a non-virtual machine lab like the initial one we launched, where it's going to be this whole pane, or if it is a virtual machine lab like this one, it's going to again be this pane, but it will not affect anything on the lab console. The lab console is with the virtualization CSS and the virtualization script. These are very seldom used, but they are possible, especially with the scripts. Sometimes organizations want to really know when users are connecting and disconnecting and all that stuff. So it gets really complex doing some of the virtualization stuff, but it is possible. So we're going to stick with our instructions though. So I'm going to save this guy now. This is the exact CSS we already had. I'm just going to copy this name and then go back to my dashboard so that I can go back to the lab. So again, just save your theme, dashboard. Your first active lab should still be running. So we go to that lab. I can see that it is running. And from here, I'm going to go to my edit profile, advanced, go to my theme and add it. Now there was just a whole bunch of clicking around the interface. So I'm going to pause there, make sure everyone can catch up. Let me know if you're having any trouble getting to that point. I'm just going to save this lab as well. Leave my note that I added a theme. Okay, not hearing from anybody, so I'm going to assume that we are all ready to keep going. So I added my theme to this lab, but my lab isn't showing it. Now that is the big difference between a theme and having that CSS directly in our lab. Just like when we were updating our instructions kind of via the offline mode, not in a live lab instance, those changes are still actually being reflected to live labs. It's just that it requires a refresh. So I'm going to refresh my screen. And boom, now my theme is in full effect, even though when I edit my instructions, my style is no longer in here. So it's now pulling it directly from that theme in LOD. The fact that it would require a refresh every time you tweak something is why it's usually really beneficial to just do your modifications here. Once you're happy with it, then move it into a theme. So let's add a little bit to that theme. Let's add some table CSS. So remember this thing here is a table. So we can make that look however we want. Maybe we want some alternate colored rows, we want borders, whatever. In our case, we're just going to add some borders. And we're gonna see here why our dot instructions is truly, truly important. So from our lab profile, we always have quick access to our theme from here. So on my details page, your theme should be listed, and you can just jump to that right from there. I'm going to edit it, and I'm going to add the table CSS right to the end here. I'm going to save that and go back to my lab instance. I'm going to do a refresh. And we should see our table get these borders now. Now, here's why the dot instructions is super, super important. Now, when we go and edit our instructions, we actually just we didn't necessarily break something, but we changed something drastically in here. If we go to our @lab menu, now this whole table is affected as well. So we're changing other things by not defining our instructions page. So I'm going to go right back into my theme because I realized I broke something. I'm going to edit, and I'm just going to add, I would add my dot instructions into both of these. So what we're doing here is the headers and the data cells. That's what these TH and TD mean. Now we could go a step further even, and let's say that we only want that table. I'm going to move this aside. We only want this table. Maybe we have a whole bunch of tables in our lab, but we only want this one specific table to have this styling. That's just where we would go back to that method of divs, these things here. And if we just wrap this in something that says creds, and then another one that, oh, I don't need text on the second one. So we just put that in its own little thing that's named creds. So now we have dot instructions, then we could limit it to even that specific table. And now I'll save my theme up. So now we have dot instructions, dot creds, th, td. I'm going to paste this into the chat since that's a pretty big change from what we had in our little cheat sheet. So now that we have that, I'll refresh my page, see if that did what I wanted it to do. Edit my instructions again, and look at my @lab menu. And now this table is working perfectly fine the way that it was originally. So now we did not break our lab. Last little bit that we want to talk about with CSS. Actually, before we unlock that, any questions on those components there? No? Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about is actually importing things from elsewhere. So this is going to be done using a little bit of JavaScript, but it's going to be importing stuff from external repositories of some sort, whether that's a CDN where you host your CSS, or we're also going to do some custom fonts. So we're going to put fancy in this box in order to unlock it. And then we're going to click this first link that goes to Google Fonts. So Google Fonts is kind of a public font repository that you can access to import other fonts into your site. I actually know which font I'm looking for. It's this Banners, this crazy looking Comic Sans wannabe. So I'm gonna copy this name, Banners, or you could just pull it right out of the URL here. And then I'm gonna minimize that window. And I'm gonna put that in this text box. So this text box is using one of those variables for us, and we'll see that it's updating our instructions based on what we put in that box. So we've got that. We're going to add this CSS. I'm just going to do it right in my style here. I'm not going to do it in my theme. So what this is now doing is it's looking for a span section that has a class of cool font, and then it's going to set my font as that Banners that I just went and found. So we're going to stick another small bit of HTML in here. It's just going to be a less than sign, span, and we're going to say our class is cool font. Now, again, we could use one of these kinds of sections for this, but this is just another way, especially for like a quick one-line thing, you can just stick it right in there with a little bit of HTML. So either of those is valid. Now, what we'll notice though, so this is on my login to the VM line. This here looks, it's kind of like a Times New Roman looking thing. But if we compare that to what I actually looked up on Google Fonts, that looks nothing like that. That's because we don't actually have that font. So we need to get that font. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this JavaScript here. And this JavaScript is going to get added into our theme. We're going to edit. Now we're going to do some instructions script. And this here is importing a theme from importing a font from an external repository. So this whole line would be pretty much the same no matter where it's coming from. And then where we have this link is going to be different depending on where you're getting your font from. In our case, we're doing it from the Google font library. So this is their method of getting that. But if you have your own CDN or you're pulling from somewhere else, that link may be different. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to save it. And now that my theme is updated, let's refresh my lab window here. And now I have my crazy Comic Sans looking font. So obviously I might want to play with the size or anything like that, but that's how we can do custom fonts that aren't kind of naturally in the platform. So if you're trying to add some font and you're noticing it's not working, it's just kind of looking weird, you probably need to import it from wherever it's being sourced. And then the last thing that we're going to do in regards to that is also going to be importing, but in this case, we're going to import CSS. So what we've just done is we did all of our CSS in our theme or in our lab directly. But what if you already have a CSS file somewhere? You know, you have, like we discussed, your organization has a theme that they kind of stick to. You know, all of your links need to be a certain color. You know, all of your bold text needs to be also italic or something like that. You know, we can apply those kinds of themes that you can import from your own CDN or wherever. So we're going to copy this JavaScript. We're going to edit our theme once again for the last time. We're going to stick this in another line here. You'll notice this is the same line as the one above it. It's just the link is different. So we're just importing a different file. In this file, so if we navigate to this actually, I'm going to save it as well. And this is something to be really cautious of when we're using externally sourced CSS. So let me get my, here we go. I'm going to follow that link. And so this is the actual CSS file that we're importing. You know, we're changing every button to have this certain look. Notice that it doesn't have our dot instructions. If it's CSS that's being used in multiple locations, such as your own website or something like that, it may not have that dot instructions. That's something to be really, really careful of. Like we just saw, you know, if you don't have dot instructions on there, it may affect other areas. So let's take a look at what happens when I refresh now that we've added it. Let's just take a look real quick. So these are some buttons. Let's create file. Notice that it's just kind of some white thin text with a blue, a darker blue button that matches our theme up here. Same with our resources tab has that. You know, anywhere that there's a button, it has its own look currently. So now if I refresh, now that we've imported our own button look, now this is a little bit bigger, it's a little more bold. If I go to the resources tab, this button has now changed. If I edit my instructions and I go in to say make an activity, you know, all of these buttons have now changed. So that just affected everything in the lab. Maybe I'm okay with that. You know, this doesn't bother me personally. I would be fine with these changes as an organization, but your organization may not. So it's just something to be really cautious of when we're importing external CSS. See exactly what is impacting if it's not using something like our dot instructions. And the other side of that, though, is perhaps it is dedicated to LOD, and you would just rather store it somewhere else rather than in a theme like this. You know, we could put this exact stuff in an external repository, import it via JavaScript, and then there we go, we're off to the races. So both of those are valid options. Just got to be careful when we're not using our dot instructions link, our class rather. And that is all I have for you guys. Does anyone have any questions on any of that last stuff, or really on anything at this point? This is our end run. Thank you, Kendra. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, there's so much that can be done. You know, using the default looks and feels that we have is often good enough, but if you really want to tailor it to meet your organization, you know, kind of like Corey mentioned in his keynote, you can make it seem as if there isn't even a third party. You know, it can just match your entire feel. All right, well, if there's no other questions, I think people can start heading out if you'd like. I'll stay here until the end, just in case anyone does have any other questions. But I guess with that, we're all set. Please come in tomorrow. We have a lot more cool sessions. Please let us know any feedback, LODS.1/feedback, and make sure we're posting some pictures, get a chance to win some prizes. We'll be here all day tomorrow as well.